welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOP-LP Newburyport at 96.3 FM on Channel 9, and will be available on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and this morning I'm very happy to welcome Kathleen Langone here. She's a freelance writer who's been published in regional New England publications, including Boston Magazine and our very own Newburyport Daily News. She's also done historical research for state agencies and universities. She's the host of People Hidden in History, a podcast series that highlights fascinating people in the arts and politics who are unknown to the general public. And she's here today to talk about her recently published biography on one such person hidden in history, Amalia Kussner. Kathleen's book, her biography, recently came out, and it is called, and would you like to hold it up?
Oh,
so show
sure.
people,
Thank you,
it's
Mary.
The Miniature Painter Revealed, Amalia Kussner's Gilded Age Pursuit of Fame and Fortune. So first of all, Kathleen, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for taking time to be here and teach us about Amalia Kussner.
Thank you, Mary. I'm delighted to be here, and I just love talking about this person.
Well, she is really, truly a fascinating individual. So we'll get into that in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
But and you've written a biography of her, and you've also done 2 podcasts about her for People Hidden in History. But before we talk about her and what makes her such an unusual and outstanding person, could you please tell us about how you got interested in doing these historical podcasts about people we don't know enough about?
Thank you, Mary. So back in 2020, a lot of us had time on our hands.
Oh, we did, didn't we?
Yes, we did. And I had been furloughed, and I had free time for about 3 months. And just before the pandemic, I went to a presentation on how to do podcasts and how to do them very cheaply. And I had Apple equipment, so I said, well, I'm going to give this a go. Then I had time. And I started to think of the many family stories I'd heard. Certainly Amalia Kussner was among them.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you hear family stories of people that might be interesting or historical. Then you do research and you say, oh, this was a really neat person, and I wish Grandma had told me more.
Yeah.
But I started this research. Amalia was the first person that I did in that series, and I started just to Google her name, as many of us do, and I found that she had traveled to do artwork for the Czar and Tsarina of Russia. Now, I had known that she had painted Edward VII of England. That's all I had known. That's all Grandma had told me. But then when I saw that she had traveled to Russia, I knew a little bit about history, that if anybody was admitted to their society and be close to the Romanov family, you had to be really somebody of stature and very artistically talented. And she published this article. I read it, and it was a very almost intimate story of her time with the Romanovs. She even became friends with Queen Alexandra, who was sort of known to be a bit of a shy person. Also, by the way, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. And after I read that, I said, well, let's dig deeper. And I had these online newspaper subscriptions, and I started to research in there, and I found hundreds of articles about her, and it just was an explosion of historical information.
It just grew.
Absolutely.
As your fascination with her grew because of what you were finding out. Well, that's a really good origin story, Kathleen. And let's talk about, and Maeve, if you could put up the photo of Amalia Kussner, it's the one that says circa 1900, while we talk about what your personal connection is. You mentioned your grandmother, so we know it's a family tie.
That's
so tell us about your family tie to Amalia that you experienced.
Most certainly. So as a little girl, my grandmother had one of these beautiful gold gilt cabinets with many oddities in there from the family over the generations, and there were 3 miniatures of Amalia's. And like I mentioned earlier, my grandmother did tell me that she had painted Edward VII, and she also added that he was sweet on her. That it maybe had some affection for her. And she even at that time had a piece of jewelry that he had given her. It was a beautiful pendant with a suspended emerald sort of framed by diamonds. But that's all I really knew about her. But again, and then a couple of my relatives, like my great uncle, did save some of her paintings, etc., in Indiana that eventually ended up in my branch of the family. And we were related to Amalia through the Weinhardt family because Amalia's mother was a Weinhardt.
Okay, yeah. So that personal connection, I'm sure, only continued and expanded your fascination with her, absolutely, because she was part of your own past and your own legacy. Well, Amalia focused on miniature portraits, and people today might think that that was like a minor art form or kind of fringy to the mainstream art world, but please set us straight on how important and popular these miniature portraits were during the Gilded Age, roughly 1890 to 1910. Why was this art form so much in demand, especially among the ultra wealthy and royalty, so that Amalia wound up doing portraits of the Czar and Tsarina?
Yes, very definitely. About the time that Amalia really got into miniature art, there was a very definite revival. It started in Paris in 1890, and Amalia obviously had an ability, an affinity, to paint these very, very small miniatures. But if you look at the context of the time, photography for a while had supplanted the miniatures that were very popular. Certainly in this country, maybe before the Civil War, a lot of miniatures were done of family members, etc. It died off, and it came back because miniatures, number one, could be in color. Obviously, we had black and white photography, though some of them would be hand painted over, but you could give a life and an emotion and a feeling to people in miniatures that photography at that time could not do. And often miniatures could be gifts, a sentimental gift to a wife, a husband, a lover, whatever, and they were also portable. Sometimes miniatures could be jewelry, it could be brooches, could even be charms on bracelets. So it was a more personal art form.
Oh, that's really interesting, that it had been popular and then went out of vogue, but then came back into popularity for the reasons you just cited. And the portability, I imagine, was also part of the appeal. And also, trends sweep people up in them. And so that was also true, that it was a trend toward popularity during the Gilded Age. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about the Gilded Age itself, what it valued, who were the 400, famously, and some of the names, other than ones you've already shared with us about the Romanovs and King Edward, some of the names we would recognize from this era that commissioned portraits by Amalia.
Well, the Gilded Age really had a number of different parts to it. Most often we might think of the very, the wealthy barons who built the railroads, etc., and then those families, for example, like the Astors and Vanderbilts. And there was also, in parallel, a lot of social change. You can't forget that you had the suffragist movement going on there, too. But Amalia came into New York in 1892. She had started her business in Indiana in the 1880s. She decided to go to New York knowing that that would really be the place to get a higher clientele, etc. So at the time that she arrived, miniatures, as I'd mentioned, were becoming popular, and she had some fortuitous connections. She had a connection to a woman by the name of Louisine Havemeyer, very rich, well-to-do woman, and she was starting an art collection. In fact, she was connected with the artist Mary Cassatt, and the two of them brought over what was then valued art collections from Europe, including the Impressionists. But Amalia did a miniature of Mrs. Havemeyer, and Mrs. Havemeyer really gave her an entree into society. So then Amalia was admitted to art shows, and her artwork became really in demand. And I'll mention, Mary, about what her style was that was very distinctive, I think, from a traditional miniature. She gave these women almost a mythical appearance, and they would not be seen in this, these high neck dresses, etc., looking very prim and demure. Amalia would wrap them in fabric. It could be satin, tulle, velvet, and much of this fabric would almost be falling off their shoulders.
We have an example. Maybe if you could put up the photo of the Grand Duchess, the miniature of the Grand Duchess, which illustrates nicely what you're talking about. So it wasn't streetwear.
Oh, absolutely not. And I think these American women embraced that, and not only were they seen as, I would say, exotic and almost sexy, she also wanted to make them to look royal. Because the leaders of the Gilded Age Society wanted to be seen as American royalty.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, I'll tell you an interesting story. I just came back from Indiana, and I saw one of her miniatures in person at a museum out there, and looking at it up close, the top of the miniature had a crown. I could see
Oh.
that. So I thought it was just filigree, but it was actually a crown. And,
Interesting.
there were so many aspects of these miniatures that made these people look regal.
Yeah. And also kind of mythological, too. I think you mentioned in your podcast, I think you make reference to Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yes, Titania,
Like
the
fairy
queen of the
princess.
fairies, yes. Uh-huh.
But she was a fairy princess. She was a royal Tatiana. So I take it that part of what you're saying is that she flattered the egos of
Very
her subjects,
definitely.
who were already very wealthy people, some of them with titles. But I guess you can never have too much.
Not from their
flattery.
perspective, no.
And made them really look, well, we've really transformed them out of the ordinary into a fairy-like or very regal kind of world.
And I'll speak a little bit about the portrait she did of Mrs. Astor. This was the Mrs. Astor that had that social list of the 400 acceptable people in New York society. At the time Amalia painted her, Mrs. Astor was already in her 60s.
Okay.
Now, she was never a terribly attractive woman, being frank, but Amalia thinned her face out and made her eyes larger and more luminous. And also, she had Mrs. Astor wear her famous ruby and diamond choker.
Okay.
So again, today you'd almost call it photoshopping, but Amalia would often just tweak these people's appearances a little bit.
So you could still tell who it was.
Oh, absolutely. Not so far off that you
Yeah.
couldn't tell who
But
they
it was
were.
a very flat, beyond show my good side to sort of slightly alter my features so I'm the most glamorous possible version of
Oh,
myself.
absolutely.
And who were some of the others? You mentioned Mrs. Astor. Who are some of the other names that we would recognize from that? I believe she did a portrait of Vanderbilt or two.
Yes, she did. She did Alva Vanderbilt. This was actually after Alva Vanderbilt got divorced. She was now Mrs. Belmont, but she did her. And again, beautified her a little bit. And I think one of the most famous people was Alva Vanderbilt's daughter, Consuelo, that many of us know was forced into a marriage with the Duke of Marlborough. Amalia actually traveled to paint her in London and painted her at the castle. And it's a very, very beautiful portrait. Consuelo had this beautiful, almost swan-like neck. She had this very innocent look, and Amalia basically captured that.
Yeah. Well, one can understand why she was in demand among the people who could afford her commission rate. And one of the distinctive things about her was that she was able to command the same kind of commission rates that the male artists were able to. So good for her. So today, Kathleen, we might call Amalia influencer, or somebody who's very, very savvy about cultivating a kind of a mystique about her background. I mean, she was, a Midwesterner from a middle-class family, and yet she launched herself into this high stratosphere of society. She also created a brand of herself as an artist by having this very distinctive, flattering kind of style. And so tell us, how was she able to leverage herself to make these kind of connections, to go from her Midwestern heritage to wind up painting royalty and all of these kind of uber wealthy people? What was her, did she have a strategy or a plan for how she was going to do this? How did she pull this off? Because it's remarkable.
It was remarkable. I think she knew that she had to appear like them. When she was able to, when she had enough money, she got House of Worth gowns. That was one of the premier fashion houses in the 1890s. So she dressed like them.
Okay.
And I think she had a very approachable personality. And, some of these miniatures would be in 5 or 6 settings. So she really had to be a good conversationalist. They had to feel comfortable with her. So, again, I think she wanted to appear as an equal to them, and maybe they
Yeah.
felt more comfortable letting her into their home and their lives to paint them.
Yeah. So she adopted some of the stylistic signals.
Oh, that's a good
She
way to put it, yes.
She was of a class and worthy of their attention. That she made herself fit in other words, with these really, really rich people, which is, an accomplishment all by itself. She was clearly, from everything you're saying, really successful, very independent, financially well off, and boldly adventurous for any era, for a man or a woman, but remarkably so for a woman of her times, because at the time, most women's ambitions were focused on marrying well.
Oh, very definitely.
But she, she took trips in the 1890s to meet Romanovs and paint Nicholas and Alexandra. And she took a trip to South Africa to meet diamond magnate Cecil Rhodes during the Boer War, for heaven's sakes.
Oh, she knew full well when she was going down there that war was about to break up. And then
she went anyway.
Yes, and I'll just talk about that a little bit. She arrived in Cape Town. She sort of had a loose invitation to paint him, even though he'd been very resistant, about letting her do his portrait. And by the time she arrives, Cecil Rhodes has left Cape Town. He's gone to Kimberley, the Kimberley compound, to try to defend it. There were already British soldiers there. Amalia decides to traipse after him. In fact, she takes the last train from Cape Town to Kimberley. When she arrives at the Kimberley compound, shortly thereafter, the Boers bomb the train tracks, so there's no way to get out. Cecil Rhodes reluctantly lets her into the compound, and they actually become friends. So if you read that her write-up about her experience there, this sort of gruff, commanding personality, he sort of becomes her friend. And she paints him in the morning. It almost seems like the Boers would bomb the complex in the afternoon. So the mornings were open. I think that they sort of had a code of honors to when they would bomb things back then.
Sitting in the morning in the bomb shelter in the afternoon.
That's exactly what it was. And so I thought that was a very interesting experience. And she never indicated any fear. She was never intimidated by these people either.
Yeah. The word fearless was going through my mind as you were talking about her. But also, the quest for adventure seems to also, would that be fair to say that was a motivator for her? She lived a big life, and she clearly wanted a big life. So good for her. But she did also marry.
She did.
And so tell us about who she wound up marrying. It clearly wasn't the primary motivator for her, but she did get married. So tell us how that unfolded and how being married then affected her career as an artist.
Yeah. Traditionally, many of the women that you read about this time, artists, had to greatly, if you will, downgrade their careers after marriage. Some of them stopped altogether. And, it's obvious no matter who she married, she would have somehow had to have continued her career. She met a gentleman, it was Charles DuPont Coderre, and he came from a very wealthy New York family. They were French Catholic. Now, because they were Catholic, they weren't really admitted to the infamous 400, but they were still very wealthy, well-connected. And she met him, and at this point, she was already lying about her age.
Oh, yes, that's an interesting chapter, and tell us about that.
Right, let's digress a bit. Shortly after she arrived in New York City, she was now almost 30. And at that time, you were seen as a woman over the hill. Yeah. But, she came to New York. She really wanted to start this fantastic career. So there was a magazine article written about her, and I think the person that interviewed her said, okay, let's make your age a little younger. So now she appeared to be in her early 20s. And then she was seen as this prodigy, this young, beautiful woman that's even more amazing because she's in her early 20s. So, and she continued that lie, if you will, her whole life. She even lied on her passport applications, which I have seen. So when she met Charles DuPont Coderre, she claimed to be his age.
Okay.
And I think he was definitely very smitten with her. And supposedly they dated off and on, so she met him in 1896, but they were physically apart quite a lot because now she was traveling over to London a lot. He did become a lawyer, which was his family's business, but shortly thereafter he went into the Spanish-American War. So he was in the Philippines for almost 2 years. So even though some newspaper articles at the time in the marriage said they dated, I don't think they were together that much. And I think for both of them, and I do believe he loved her, I don't know whether or not she loved him, they thought out of convenience they would get married. And he thought it would also help his law career, essentially. when they got married, they went on this long honeymoon in Europe, and she continued to paint. She already had these commissions, and when they came back to New York, he stopped his business. He left the family law business, and I think just became a support for her all those years. They never had children. They did stay together until she died in 1932. It's an interesting relationship. I don't know if we'll ever understand it, but that's what it was. And again, he allowed her to continue her career, which a typical man at that time would not have done.
Their ego would not have allowed them to feel like they were being competed with or overshadowed by somebody as successful and as incredibly well connected as Amalia clearly was. So that's an interesting kind of match. It's interesting to me that she changed her age, including on her passport. I remember that from the podcast that I listened to about her. But, you know, she is very savvy about what makes somebody stand out from the crowd and become marketable. Today we'd call it going viral and develop a reputation. And certainly instead of being an over-the-hill, although very talented artist, that's not competitive with a prodigy in her 20s who was doing amazing things. It just gets more attention.
And if I could add, the other lie that she told, she claimed that she never had art lessons, that her ability was just natural to who she was, and she in fact did have art lessons both in Indiana and New York City, so that was the other part of her mystique, that she just magically had this ability.
But that makes her instantly more interesting to people as well. She just kind of created her own narrative of her life, and it helped her develop the kind of connections and networking that she clearly needed to be able to succeed, especially among the higher stratospheres that she was aiming at. Well, you know, Newburyport has its own very well-known miniature painter. Tell us a little bit about Laura Coombs Hill, who was from Newburyport and was also very successful as an artist.
It's very interesting. I was reading up on her, you know, before this interview, Mary. They were basically contemporaries. Laura Coombs Hills was born about 6 years before Amalia, but again, very same time frame. And certainly I think that her interest and ability with miniatures was in parallel to the rise of the interest of miniatures in the United States and in Europe. But I think she was a more serious artist. And miniatures were not her only style. She did, I think, a lot of still lifes, beautiful flower paintings. Watercolor was her medium, but she did get into miniatures, and I think there's no doubt in my mind that these two ladies knew of each other. But their lives took very different paths. Laura Coombs Hills was one of the founders of, I think, like an American Miniaturist Society. So there were societies at this time that if you were a member of, you could be in contest, if you will. There's more apt to see your artwork in museums. So she had a more traditional path as an artist, whereas Amalia, though she had this phenomenal clientele, did not become a member of these societies. I'm not sure if she wasn't asked to be in them or felt she didn't need them. And, you know, eventually Amalia's career stopped around 1910, 1911, whereas Laura Coombs Hills, I think she did miniatures up until 1920. So the length of their careers were different. And I think they were just very different people. I don't think Laura Coombs Hills had the exotic personality or lived the life or had the connections. But, you know, again, I think was a more serious artist.
Interesting. Well, for people who are interested in learning more about Laura Coombs Hill from Newburyport, the Newburyport Art Association is actually sponsoring on June 7th, coming up in a couple of days, an event, a fundraiser called Coombs and Blooms, which will include a talk by Museum of Old Newbury's Bethany Groff-Durau on Laura Coombs Hill. So anybody who's interested can certainly look up information about that at the Newburyport Art Association. Well, back to Amalia. You've made comparisons between Amalia's style of portraiture and contemporary photographers. So I'd be interested in, Kathleen, in hearing you talk about whose modern work do you think evokes Amalia's legacy and why?
Well, I could think of the photographer in England in the 1930s, Cecil Beaton.
Oh, yes.
I think, you know, really sort of capturing people in very personality-forward portraits, if you will. And then, of course, Annie Leibovitz.
Oh, yes.
You know, and her portraits of women. I think that Amalia really wanted not only to have this exoticness, but really have what I would term a personality-forward portrait of these women.
Yeah. And do you think she would have focused her talent on photography if she were around today?
It's
I mean,
really,
miniature painting wouldn't get you anywhere today.
Oh, certainly not. I mean, probably, I think that she would use any medium, I think, that could be very expressive and get the artwork and the view of these people that she wanted to do.
Interesting. Well, those are good comparisons, I think, in terms of very well-known photographers who also cultivated relationships with, today we'd use the word celebrities. Well, I'm curious, because as we've been saying throughout our whole conversation about Amalia, she just did things that it was highly unusual for women to be able to do. So, Kathleen, would you describe Amalia as a feminist trailblazer? And is that how you think she'd have seen herself?
I mean, she was a feminist trailblazer, but she did not actively participate in any of these suffragist movements or marches. I will note that after I finished the book, I found out that Susan B. Anthony had visited her town in Indiana when she was a teenager. So I think she was around, the sense that women could be more than society was allowing them at that time. And I think her family was socially forward, a little bit liberal. So she was around that sort of attitude. But she pretty much took what she needed to be who she was. She didn't want to wait for the vote. She said, this is what I want to do. I want to charge the same commissions as men. And but again, she really wasn't documented with the suffragists per se at that time.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because she certainly embodied feminist ideals, didn't she? She was not going to be constrained. She was going to be anybody's equal, including how much she was paid. But that was separate from, I guess, becoming an activist in the field. But she certainly pioneered an independent way of being in the world and being very successful and doing things your own way, and not being constrained by any kind of stereotypes about what women can or can't do. We've got to give her credit for that.
Oh, definitely.
So, well, you've been giving book talks about Amalia, and I'm curious to find out, as you talk to people and free her up from having been hidden in history, so she's out in the open now and we can all see her and learn about her fascinating life. How have people been responding to Amalia's life and her work? What have people been curious about, and what's been most interesting to you about how people respond to her art and her life?
I think, again, people are very surprised even to learn about her. I've talked to some museums that have miniature collections, and they didn't actually even know about her
really?
Per se.
Interesting.
And the other thing is, we've talked pretty much about her artwork and how she made it into the upper echelons of society. She did have a very odd lawsuit against her in 1901. And the lawsuit, both the lawyers on the plaintiff and Amalia's side never wanted to reveal the contents of the lawsuit. And it was publicly known that it was for $125,000, which was a huge amount of money at that time, which makes me think it could have been an indiscretion of some sort. And again, to this day, we don't know what it was. One of my goals is to research and find out what the lawsuit is. So that's something that has fascinating people. What did she do that would have had this lawsuit brought against her?
Yeah, it just makes you curious, doesn't it?
It really does, and it's almost like I don't want to find out, but I think I'm going to try to dig it up.
I think you have to find out.
You're right, yes.
And it'll be interesting, whatever it is.
No.
I hope. Maybe it's something really dull, but you'll find out, and that'll be interesting in its own right. She continues to draw a certain amount of funding. I wondered, would you like to talk about the Tiffany's brooch that was on auction?
Yes.
And we have, Maeve, if you could put up, we have the Tiffany brooch, if you could put that picture up while Kathleen tells the story, because her artwork is still selling.
Oh, very definitely. So this was just a wonderful thing that happened about a month ago. Out of the blue, I was contacted by Bonham's Auction House. And they had a Amalia Kussner miniature that they were going to sell, but not only was it a Kussner miniature, it was in a frame done by Tiffany's with diamonds. It was a platinum frame, and it was a very, very distinguished gentleman with a mustache and a goatee, and they wanted to see if I could help identify him. We never did identify who he was, but it was so marvelous because the auction started on the exact day that my book was published, on May 6th.
Oh, that's perfect.
And I actually worked with Bonham's. I added a little bit to their description of the piece, and we had very definite evidence that she worked at Tiffany's. I had seen anecdotal definite historical records, but now we knew she definitely was there because her portrait was in a Tiffany frame.
Well, that's really interesting, and I think it sold for like $2,500 or nearly $3,000. I think.
I think a little over $3,000.
Yeah, so still making money.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kathleen. It's so much fun. I really appreciate your teaching us about this amazing person who had been hidden in history, but no more, we hope. So if people are interested in learning more about Amalia or learning more about people hidden in history, how can they do that?
Probably the best thing at this point is if you could go to my website, just www.kathleenlangone.com, and there's the proverbial contact page, and I love to hear from people, so please
Wonderful.
Connect with me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for bringing Amalia to our awareness, and thanks for taking time to visit the morning show. I really appreciate it. It's been so much fun to talk to you.
Thanks so much, Mary.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. That's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show, and until then, everybody, please be well.